In 1943, 2 years after America entered the Second World War, many American destroyers had been destroyed by sea mines laid by Nazi German forces. In addition, the strength of American ships was far inferior, and the famous German U-boats always defeated them. In the middle of the Second World War, Germany and its Nazis seemed invincible, with Nazi forces occupying almost all of Europe and even North Africa. At that time, America was not yet a superpower. Even its military power was only the 10th largest in the world and accounted for only half the power of Britain. To avoid defeat in the Second World War, the American military inevitably had to do something to create an edge in warfare. But if the advantage is only in the number of war-ready troops, it will take a lot of time. For this reason, the American military chose to develop technology in its arsenal. Armed with knowledge from the theories of famous scientists such as Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein regarding electromagnetics and unified field theory, on October 28, 1943, the American military was strongly suspected of conducting an extreme experiment that claimed many lives. In this video, let's learn more about the Philadelphia experiment. On October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge, a cannon-class destroyer, docked at the Navy shipyard in Philadelphia. The ship was equipped with several large generators. The USS Eldridge was designed to win the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II. The generators installed in the ship were designed to drive a new magnetic field that would make the USS Eldridge invisible to radar and undetectable to enemy mines. The experiment began at noon that day with a whole crew and in the presence of nearby ships. After raising the anchor, the captain gave the signal, and the generator switches were activated. When the generators were switched on, a thick green mist appeared and illuminated the USS Eldridge. Witnesses on ships near the USS Eldridge described a strange blue-green glow surrounding the hull and then engulfing the ship entirely. Then, as the green haze faded, seconds later, the Eldridge was invisible to military radar. But what happened next was unexpected and baffled scientists. The ship was not only undetected by radar, but also invisible to everyone's eyes. Eventually, it disappeared and mysteriously appeared in Norfolk, Virginia, which is about 446 kilometers from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But what puzzled military officials, scientists, and eyewitnesses even more was that the USS Eldridge was spotted in Norfolk, Virginia, 10 minutes ahead of its disappearance in Philadelphia. It reappeared 20 minutes later at its original location in Philadelphia. When the ship was inspected, a horrifying sight greeted those who inspected the ship. Many of the crew members of the USS Eldridge were seen suffering from severe burns and disoriented consciousness. Some of the crew members were fused to the metal walls of the hull, and their bodies were challenging to detach until they died in agony. Also, some of the surviving crew members then screamed hysterically and went crazy, and some other crew members reportedly just disappeared. The story of the Philadelphia experiment is indeed a story that, until now, has made no sense and is still a mystery regarding its truth. But when this story surfaced to the public, many believed it, and please remember why many believed it. In those years, it was an era when America had ambitions to become a superpower, so it is not surprising that America, in a state of military strength that is less competitive, makes sense with technology and various extreme experiments to excel on the battlefield. But the question is, where did the story of the Philadelphia experiment begin? It all started in 1955, when Morris Ketchum Jessup received a mysterious letter in the mail. Jessup had a master's degree in astronomy, and in those years had just published a book called The Case for the UFO, which told of his theories regarding the propulsion engine technology that flying saucers might use. In his book, Jessup also explains that anti-gravity technology, or electromagnetic manipulation, may be responsible for the strange lights that accompany UFO sightings. In its early days, this book stirred the American public because it was written by an actual scientist who believed in aliens. In this book, Jessup seems to want to invite Americans to not close their minds to the possibility that there is another advanced life apart from human civilization on Earth. Because a scientist wrote it, conspiracy ideas about aliens and UFOs then seemed to gain credibility. Americans who believed in the existence of aliens were happy with the book, and many of these people began to write letters to Jessup telling him that they saw strange phenomena in the sky. None of these letters impressed Jessup until, on January 13, 1955, a man named Carlos Miguel Allende wrote to Jessup, telling him that in October 1943, he was assigned to the U.S. Navy shipyard in Philadelphia and witnessed an experiment in which the destroyer USS Eldridge suddenly disappeared into a murky green cloud. The missing USS Eldridge appeared in Virginia 10 minutes earlier before returning to its original place in Philadelphia. Allende, in his letter, also told Jessup that many of the crew members of the experimental ship were fused to the ship's steel bulkheads. Others lay dead and burned, and others were missing and did not return. Allende also said that the experiment was based on Albert Einstein's unified field theory, where electromagnetism and the theory of general relativity merge into one field that is believed to bend gravity and make ships undetectable by radar. Allende also said that the experiment failed miserably due to scientists' mistakes in understanding molecular changes on a quantum scale. Because of the failure and horror of the results of the experiment, the American military and government tried to cover it up. Jessup, who read Allende's letter, was then curious, and because of his curiosity, Jessup found out Allende's identity. It was known that Carlos Miguel Allende's name was a pseudonym, and his real name was Carl Meredith Allen. No one knows why Allen uses a pseudonym, but what can be ascertained is that Allen was once stationed at the American Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia. But what confused Jessup was that on October 28, 1943, in the records of American naval ships, the USS Eldridge was in New York and not in Philadelphia. Still, Jessup did not immediately conclude that what Allen said in his letter was a lie. So Jessup wrote back to Allen and asked for proof of what Allen had told him. However, Allen could not fulfill his reply in evidence, and after not being able to prove it, Jessup ignored what Allen told him and assumed that Allen was just a braggart. But a few years later, in 1957 to be precise, two officers from the newly formed American Naval Research Office, also known as the U.S. Navy Office of Naval Research, suddenly appeared at Jessup's doorstep and asked him to come to their office. When he arrived at the Office of Naval Research, Jessup confronted a naval officer and discovered something he had never imagined before. He saw the book he had written lying on the officer's desk, but within its pages were small notes that seemed to attempt to explain the book's contents. The book was complete with handwritten notes in the margins, written in 3 shades of blue ink. The notes discussed Jessup's ideas on how flying saucers could move and other technologies allowing the American government to make breakthroughs. The note also stated that Jessup's idea made much sense to invent such advanced technology. The officer then asked Jessup if he had sent the book to him, or did he know who had sent it. Jessup replied that he didn't know, and indeed he didn't know anything about it. But he remembered something. The little notes in the book reminded him of someone, Carl Meredith Allen. After Jessup returned home from the Office of Naval Research, his mind was filled with questions about how his book got into the hands of American Navy researchers, and why would the book and the small notes be discussed in such detail. Finally, he went back to see Allen, and in that meeting, Allen later admitted that it was his doing. After being disbelieved by Jessup, Allen continued his intention to spread his terrible experience of the experiments he witnessed. In his confession, Allen made footnotes in Jessup's book and linked it to American naval experiments conducted in Philadelphia waters. After making many footnotes to Jessup's book, Allen reprinted 100 copies of the book, one of which was on the officer's desk at the Office of Naval Research, and it was from here that the story of the Philadelphia experiments spread across America. However, as is always the case, the American government and military denied the existence of the experiment, telling us that it was a hoax and a conspiracy. But Jessup always wondered if the experiment never happened. Why did U.S. Naval Research Office officers question his book on flying saucer technology and the footnotes Allen made about the USS Eldridge ship that became a test? This made Jessup suspicious. He then tried to investigate Allen's story about the experiment in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, Jessup could not find evidence other than mere rumors supporting Allen's story. Because his obsession with uncovering the Philadelphia experiment did not find a bright spot, it brought him down. Plus, the 2 books published in those years did not sell as well as his first book. From all these events in 1959, Jessup was found dead, which he suspected of ending his life. But the matter of his death became its conspiracy. Did he end his life, or did the government deliberately eliminate him because he continued to pry into the experiments in Philadelphia? This question can be strengthened because it is known that before his death, a year before, in 1958, for whatever reason, he left the results of his research on the Philadelphia experiment to a friend named Ivan Sanderson. When Jessup left the results of his study to Ivan, he spoke in a pleading and threatening tone so that Ivan would keep his research safe in case anything happened to him. A few months later, on April 19, 1959, Jessup wrote to his friend Manson Valentine and told Manson that he would make a breakthrough in his findings, and he wanted to meet him to share his findings in person. But until the next day, Jessup never showed up at the meeting with Manson. On that day, April 20th, 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car due to carbon monoxide poisoning that somehow got into his car. The police said that Jessup ended his life, but strangely, Jessup's body was never autopsied. That's what makes Jessup's death a reinforcement of the conspiracy of the Philadelphia experiment. In 1988, a man named Al Bielek claimed to be a survivor of the USS Eldridge. Bielek claimed to have been on board the USS Eldridge when it disappeared. Bielek was even able to give quite a detailed account of what happened. In his story, Bielek said that when the ship returned off the coast of Philadelphia, he and several other survivors were evacuated and taken to a certain facility. There, they spent several days before being released. Bielek doesn't remember anything that happened at the facility. He only remembers that he was suddenly out of the military and living an ordinary life. Bielek believes that he was brainwashed while at the facility because all he remembers is a feeling of happiness. He completely forgot about the horrific events he experienced while on the USS Eldridge. Her memories only resurfaced when one day Bielek overheard a conversation of people talking about the USS Eldridge, and somehow, the memory of her being on the ship suddenly resurfaced. That's when he decided to speak publicly. On the other hand, in its records, the American Navy in the 1940s stated that it did conduct experiments at the Philadelphia Navy shipyard. Still, the experiment aimed to make American ships invisible to German underwater mines. Much earlier in the early 1930s, the University of Chicago was also noted to be investigating the possibility of making an object invisible through electric fields. This was possibly the unified field theory proposed by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein never experimented with his theory, so until his death it was only a concept. However, Einstein believed that in scientific calculations, humans not only deal with height, width, and length, but also with one other dimension, namely time. According to Albert Einstein's theory, the concepts of space-time and material energy are not two separate entities at all. They can be intertwined under certain circumstances, and if that happens, it is not impossible that objects can appear and disappear suddenly as if experiencing a dematerialization process. The unified field theory is not an ordinary theory of physics. It is so complex that it is challenging to develop. Until now, it has been considered unsolved because no one has been able to come up with a mathematical equation to explain it. Another physicist, Nikola Tesla, claimed to have been able to explain the unified field theory, but unfortunately, his explanation was not published until his death. In 1939, the University of Chicago's unfinished project was moved to the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies near Philadelphia. Here, the researchers presented their findings to the American military, which was interested in using them on the battlefield. It's worth remembering that the world was in a state of great war at the time, so it's no surprise that every country's military was competing to create the greatest and deadliest weapons. So the Philadelphia experiment could have been carried out despite the government's denials. Still, the Philadelphia experiment has become a widespread rumor in the American Navy and the idea for many books, documentaries, and movies.